All right. So, hello, Science Nines. Sorry, I guess you could just see me here briefly. I'm just working I'm going to do a presentation for you on chapter 4. So, I just want to go through all the terms and maybe show you a few examples, and then you'll be able to work through the review questions that are just having you get familiar with this vocabulary. Okay. So, uh, we're talking about how human activity affects the diversity in biological systems, and what that really means is how do humans impact uh, the environment and the plants and the animals? Okay, so the first definition that we need to know is the term extinction. Okay, so this is when an entire species is completely wiped out from the planet. They do not exist on the planet after something happens. Okay, the classic example is the dinosaurs, but they're not the only ones. As you list in the notes, there's animals like the dodo bird, the West African black rhino. Um, Quite unfortunately, some of these species went extinct because of the impact of humans. Okay. However, there is so extinction. I think is the most severe. There's no recovery from extinction. One that's not as bad is called extirpation. Extirpation. This is when a species is kind of removed or wiped out, but only within a certain area. So they're not completely exterminated from the entire planet. The two examples are the black-footed ferret and the plains wolf. Famously, the black-footed ferret fed on ground squirrels, and as humans kind of expanded into West, at least in North America, the black-footed ferret actually primarily only ate ground squirrels. So it didn't take too long, and the ferret was not found anywhere. And for a number of years, scientists thought that the ferret had gone extinct. But it turns out, I think it was in the 70s, a very small population of black-footed ferrets was found, and due to great lengths of preservation, the black-footed ferret is no longer. I believe it's a protected species now, but it has rebounded. But for a long time, it was not found in North America. So that's why it was listed as an example of extirpation. Now, the plains wolf here in Alberta and across the plains of Canada, basically as the bison went away, so did the wolf. And the wolf basically moved into other habitats, leaving the plains altogether. So by this definition as well, the plains wolf experienced extirpation, or you could say the plains wolf was extirpated. All right. So slightly less than that, than both of those, is the term endangered. These are species that are right on the edge of becoming either extirpated or extinct. And primarily in Alberta, these are three listed endangered species. We have the swift fox on the left there, and then of course the bison. The bison was recently reintroduced into Banff National Park, which is kind of cool, as an ongoing effort to try and preserve that species in the wild. And the bottom right is a whooping crane. We have sandhill cranes that are a little more common. They are brown in their color, but a whooping crane is white. And it does make quite the sound, as it has its name for. So those are endangered species. Now, just before this, so we're kind of getting less and less at risk, if you will, at least in Alberta, we have a designation for threatened species. So these species were endangered at one point, and efforts have been made now. Their populations have rebounded, and they are still protected, but they're not in as high a risk as the endangered species. So in the top left is the peregrine falcon, absolutely awesome bird. It holds world records for the fastest diving speeds. It exceeds over 100 kilometers an hour. I think it's 150, 160 kilometers per hour. It just drops like a rocket out of the sky and then explodes with its talons open on its prey. Really, really cool falcon. Anyway, it had been put at risk because of a pesticide called DDT years ago, and that made its eggs soft, and so it was not able to reproduce as it should. And as such, it almost got wiped out, but efforts have been made to bring it back. Now the grizzly bear, if you notice in the top right, classic hump. The grizzly bear largely has been a problem among ranchers, and at least in Alberta directly, and it definitely has been listed as threatened. The grizzly bear is quite a versatile animal because of its range and how much food, I mean, different kinds of food that it eats, but it definitely was a bit at risk. So it's been listed as threatened. And then the bottom right is the bull trout. I really like fishing, and the bull trout is, at one point, it was definitely at risk of being beaten out by other more successful fish like the rainbow trout, the cutthroat trout, and various rivers and lakes here in Alberta. But the bull trout has been stabilized as a population and is no longer endangered, but is still threatened. So you cannot keep a bull trout. If you catch one, you're required by law to release it. So nature can affect biodiversity. And when I say biodiversity, again, it's the ability of an organism to reproduce and successfully and create slight variations in its DNA to enable it to be successful and healthy on the planet. Nature can affect biodiversity through a number of different ways, as you saw in your notes. Catastrophic events is the first one. Clearly, the asteroid impact that the theory reigns that's what wiped out the dinosaurs. That was a massive catastrophic event that dramatically altered life on our planet and happened millions of years ago. Things like volcanoes, earthquakes, those types of things can kind of wreak havoc on varying species, depending on how widespread they are. Another one is overpopulation. This one's closely tied to what we'll learn later called invasive species. But if a population goes unchecked for some reason, maybe the predators got a disease or got sick, or were not able to reproduce, and so in this case, this is a picture of rabbits in Australia. If their population goes unchecked, then they can get so populous that they start to consume all of their food sources. And then the next thing you know, they're starting to be at threat of being endangered or extinct. And so overpopulation has a close second, and that is if you have higher numbers of population, you have there are higher chances of disease. And this picture captures, what potentially happens amongst livestock and large herds. The probability of disease or disease spreading and affecting multiple organisms is quite high, or it's higher when the population's high. So those are things, but those are things that just occur naturally, though. We contrast that with how do humans affect it. So I don't think this is too hard to imagine. There's actually, if you have any sense of wildlife and nature, the impact that humans have on it. One massive one, though, is habitat destruction. And here you can see an open pit mine in Alberta. We've had a lot of protests against this recently because mining companies wanted to do something like this in extracting coal and other minerals from the ground. And as you can imagine, this would definitely have a massive impact on a region or an ecosystem if we dug a big hole in the ground like this. This is another picture. I believe this is I don't know if this is in the Amazon or not. I can't tell by those trees, but those could be pine trees. Anyway, deforestation is absolutely horrible in this sense. Alberta and many of parts of North America practice, responsible harvesting of trees and of lumber. And so this type of what you're seeing in this picture does not happen extensively in North America because of the heavy regulations against it. Because it definitely removes all the wildlife and makes it impossible for anything it takes generations to recover from something this severe. So that's habitat destruction. The second one is pollution. And this one kind of really resonated with me recently. What you're seeing here is a picture of the earth and of the kind of concentrations of plastic that have entered our oceans. And most specifically, we're going to focus on zone number 3 there. It's called the North Pacific Gyre, if I'm saying that right. It's kind of driven, well, all of these concentrations of ocean plastic are driven by the ocean currents and the prevailing winds. And these concentrations have grown insanely large in the last 10 to 15 years to the point that they're starting to affect the wildlife significantly in a bad way. And too much pollution, of course, can kill and disrupt the populations of wildlife, animals and plants. This is a picture of, imagine coming across this in a pristine ocean. It's just kind of sickening to see all this plastic floating on the surface. A really heartbreaking example of this is an island that's near Hawaii, out kind of right in the center of the Pacific Ocean. And the name of the island is called the Midway Atoll, Midway Atoll. Here is one of the largest breeding sites of the largest bird, the albatross. Okay, so it's basically like a super huge seagull, and these birds nest here by the millions in their mating season. Unfortunately, albatrosses skim fish near the surface of the ocean, and guess what is floating in huge amounts at the surface of the ocean waters in the Pacific? It's plastic. So these albatrosses, as they're fishing, often they mistake plastic for fish, but even in the course of trying to get fish, they also pick up plastic. As you can see in this bottom left-hand picture, they are feeding it to their chicks, and literally their chicks' stomachs are filling full of plastic and killing them. And thousands and thousands of albatrosses die every year on this island because of this, and the problem is not going away. So that's really quite tragic. And the extent of plastics across the world continues to concentrate in the oceans. And so I'm really encouraged by this company here, and there are others that I'm aware of, but this company called the Ocean Cleanup, actually founded in 2013, have been doing extensive work to try to clean up the oceans. And they've come up with some really cool innovations. The first one here is this kind of, you see in the top right-hand corner, they have this apparatus that's basically a floating boom that has a sea anchor, if you can see that. It's kind of like almost like a parachute that's dragging in the ocean. And that sea anchor provides enough resistance that the floating plastic on top can, over time, get blown into this floating boom and get collected. Now, then a ship needs to come out, as you can see in the picture, and remove the plastic. But the Ocean Cleanup has looked to install hundreds of these in various parts of the ocean to look to start to capture this plastic. And you can see in the bottom left-hand corner here, basically we look roughly today, the concentration of what are called microplastics. So plastics take forever to decompose. Fragments of really small pieces of plastic called microplastics continue to concentrate in the ocean. And if we don't do anything, it'll just exponentially keep building up, and pretty soon it'll kill fish, and it'll make it almost impossible to go fishing in the ocean for seafood. But the Ocean Cleanup's goal, of course, is to look, they actually want to reduce the amount of plastic by 90%, which is fantastic. Now, they've also done extensive research and realized that one of the main sources for plastic in the ocean comes from all of the rivers around on all the continents, which is not a surprise. But they've identified over 1,000 rivers that are significantly polluting the ocean. And I'm going to show you this short video clip to show you what they've invented and they've started deploying to actually collect the plastic before it even gets into the ocean, which is just a great idea. So here we go.
The Ocean Cleanup develops technology to rid the world's oceans of plastic. To do so, we need to not only clean up the plastic that is currently there, but also stop new plastic from entering the ocean. We need to close the tap. Most plastic in the ocean originates from rivers. Our research found that 1,000 rivers are responsible for 80% of plastic entering the oceans. So far, solutions to stop river plastic have been few and designed only for individual locations. Until now. Meet the Interceptor. Developed by the Ocean Cleanup, this is the first scalable solution to prevent river plastic from entering the oceans. This is how it works. The solar-powered interceptors are strategically located in the river. Debris flows into the system, while boats are still able to pass. The barrier directs waste to the mouth of the interceptor. Here, a conveyor belt extracts the debris from the water onto a shuttle. Because the system functions autonomously, the shuttle knows when to equally distribute the waste into one of 6 dumpsters located on a separate barge. At any time, operators can remotely access the interceptor's dashboards from anywhere in the world. Once full, the interceptor automatically sends a message to local operators. The barge is brought back to shore, emptied for recycling, and reattached for further collection. At top performance, the interceptor can extract up to 100,000 kilograms of trash per day. Working together with governments and private companies, we aim to tackle these 1,000 most polluting rivers in 5 years' time, helping us to close the tap and achieve our goal of ridding the world's oceans of plastic. Find out how to help at theoceancleanup.com.
Okay, I absolutely love that. That gives me a lot of hope in the engineers and those that are contributing financially to companies like this, and making it a business, turning it into a profitable business where that recycle, all that garbage can be pulled out and done, and something can be done useful with it. Their way we're keeping it out of our oceans. So the next one is the introduction of non-native species, or what are called invasive species. So I'm just going to play this and then we can talk about it afterwards.
Massive vines that blanket the southern United States, climbing as high as 100 feet as they uproot trees and swallow buildings. A ravenous snake that is capable of devouring an alligator. Rabbit populations that eat themselves into starvation. These aren't horror movie concepts, they're real stories. But how could such situations exist in nature? All 3 are examples of invasive species. Organisms harmful not because of what they are, but where they happen to be. The kudzu vine, for example, had grown quietly in its native East Asia, eaten by various insects and dying off during the cold winters. But its fortunes changed when it was imported into the southeastern United States for porch decoration and cattle feed. Its planting was even subsidized by the government to fight soil erosion. With sunny fields, a mild climate, and no natural predators in its new home, the vine grew uncontrollably until it became known as the plant that ate the South. Meanwhile, in Florida's Everglades, Burmese pythons, thought to have been released by pet owners, are the cause of decreasing populations of organisms. They're successfully outcompeting top predators, such as the alligator and panther, causing a significant reduction in their food sources. They're not a problem in their native Asia because diseases, parasites, and predators help to control their population size. And in Australia, European rabbits eat so many plants that they wipe out the food supply for themselves and other herbivores. They're a pretty recent addition, intentionally introduced to the continent because one man enjoyed hunting them. Like the Burmese pythons, various factors in their native habitat keep their numbers in control. But in Australia, the lack of predators and a climate perfect for year-long reproduction allows their populations to skyrocket. So, why does this keep happening? Most of the world's ecosystems are the result of millennia of co-evolution by organisms, adapting to their environment and each other until a stable balance is reached. Healthy ecosystems maintain this balance via limiting factors, environmental conditions that restrict the size or range of a species. These include things like natural geography and climate, food availability, and the presence or absence of predators. For example, plant growth depends on levels of sunlight and soil nutrients. The amount of edible plants affects the population of herbivores, which in turn impacts the carnivores that feed on them. And a healthy predator population keeps the herbivores from becoming too numerous and devouring all the plants. But even minor changes in one factor can upset this balance, and the sudden introduction of non-native organisms can be a pretty major change. A species that is evolved in a separate habitat will be susceptible to different limiting factors, different predators, different energy sources, and different climates. If the new habitat's limiting factors fail to restrict the species' growth, it will continue to multiply, outcompeting native organisms for resources and disrupting the entire ecosystem. Species are sometimes introduced into new habitats through natural factors like storms, ocean currents, or climate shifts. The majority of invasive species, though, are introduced by humans. Often this happens unintentionally, as when the zebra mussel was accidentally brought to Lake Erie by cargo ships. But as people migrate around the world, we have also deliberately brought our plants and animals along, rarely considering the consequences. But now that we're learning more about the effects of invasive species on ecosystems, many governments closely monitor the transport of plants and animals and ban the imports of certain organisms. But could the species with the most drastic environmental impact be a group of primates who emerged from Africa to cover most of the world? Are we an invasive species?
Yes, are we an invasive species? I think it's pretty clear by that definition humans are. We've definitely disrupted like every ecosystem practically on the planet. Um, but yes, so an invasive or exotic species can easily disrupt the natural balance in a native ecosystem. And so anyway, this picture here shows an extensive effort by farmers and others or ranchers and hunters in Australia to try and remove all these rabbits. Anyway, it was crazy. They couldn't keep on top of them. No, the rabbits just multiplied insanely. But I think, as I understand now, that population problem is more stable in Australia. But it was definitely nothing they expected when they first brought them there. Here's the Burmese python, as you saw in that video. There's a picture of a Burmese python in Florida, the Everglades in Florida. What a crazy predator to introduce to that ecosystem, because it essentially had no predators, and the Burmese python is not native at all to Florida whatsoever. Here's a picture of basically a Burmese python that tried to eat a really large crocodile and got too greedy, I guess. Anyway, it's absolutely crazy what has happened with that specific example of invasive species. So yeah, there are others, or there are other of the third or fourth, sorry, I should say, cause that of human extinction, I guess, or sorry, the human impact that caused extinction is just overhunting. Okay, this is definitely what happened on the plains here in Canada, with millions of buffalo being killed, and to the point that they were essentially 100% wiped out. They were no longer on the plains. Others, as you may know, are killing of elephants and rhinos in Africa for their tusks and their horns. Very, very tragic in the sense that a lot of these populations have been severely affected by poaching, as it's called. The black rhino, African black rhino, has gone extinct because of that. Fortunately, there's lots of efforts made by governments to block poaching because it's illegal. And you see pictures like this that kind of make you cringe. That hunters are obviously killing elephants and just taking their tusks. Here's some other pictures that show the evidence of the same thing. And then, of course, in this case, the elephants who were dependent on their mother most likely just died alongside her, which is sad. The trade it's been a war basically for governments against the poaching trade. And this is showing a collection of illegally harvested elephant tusks, which is just staggering. This is a rhino. This picture I know won awards for kind of portraying this problem in various parts of the continent of Africa. And you can see here how it's done. It's basically just a chainsaw is used to remove the valuable the valuable horn. Now, other countries have similar problems. This, of course, I think this is in Thailand. the illegal hunting of tigers and tigers, and for their skins. The tigers have always been threatened, of course, just by the expansion of human population, but hunting them even, I guess, jeopardizes their population even further. We have the same problem in some cases in North America. That's why we have hunting and fishing game wardens that enforce the protections against illegally killing wildlife that affects their populations. So, there's nothing wrong with hunting per se, but doing so without purposefully using the animal is definitely a problem. So, beyond those human examples, there's one other example here about how animals themselves can basically kind of hurt their population. And the word here is over-specialization. This occurs in some species where they only eat specific foods. And when they do that, then they're at huge risk when those specific foods become unavailable. They have no other food source to turn to. So panda bears are a classic example. They only eat bamboo. And as such, if their bamboo population is jeopardized by human expansion, growth of cities, that kind of thing, then the panda bear has nothing else to eat. And so that's not an advantage on their part. And so that's another factor that can affect them. The koala bear is another one. The koala bear only eats eucalyptus leaves and no other leaves, which is quite interesting. But because of that, the koala bear is definitely at risk if its main food source is also jeopardized. So those are two examples of over-specialization. So where we want to shift now is ways that humans have actually done some potentially positive things about interacting with species. And humans have been really good over generations at selecting traits in organisms that are beneficial, both for plants and for animals. So in a lot of these cases, it's easier to talk about animals, but we've definitely done it with plants too. So the first term you need to know is artificial selection. As it says in the notes, this is where you select or you breed certain individuals to make certain traits. So every one of these dogs you see here, actually, a lot of them have common ancestors, and humans over time have, found organisms that are either short or small or tall or big, and you keep selecting those and breeding those organisms with other organisms that have desirable traits, and you do that over generations, and you can get a really wide range of diverse looking dogs. Okay. Now we don't only just do it with dogs. This is a picture that shows chickens, and you can kind of see the progression from 1957 onward. Now, arguably, there's also some genetic interventions here with these chickens, but you can see that over time, if you were a chicken breeder, you could consistently look for all the chickens that are the biggest, and you keep breeding those chickens with each other so that you can get bigger and bigger chickens. And obviously the benefit here is that you can get more meat per chicken. And all of us love chicken, and so we benefit from farmers that have gotten very smart in how they raise meat. Another class one, of course, is horses. The diversity in horses is almost as broad as it is in dogs in terms of color and style. You can you breed really strong horses, the draft horses for hauling heavy loads and doing a lot of farm work, and then obviously different show horses, and then race horses, and the variety in color is quite impressive. Oh yes, I inherited these from Mr. Janisco, just in case you realize that natural selection, or once you realize natural selection is still at work. So natural selection, though, is where nature does the selecting. Okay, so humans are not intervening; it's just Mother Nature. And I know these are kind of spoofs on what's happening naturally, but these guys obviously aren't very smart in what they're doing to power their grill. And can you mess with natural selection? The point is, if you are messing with natural selection, you are actually doing artificial selection, because as humans, we do that all the time. So, but natural selection is just when nature itself and all of the conditions that exist in an ecosystem, they select for the strongest and the most capable and the most the species that are the most able to survive. Okay. So the third part of selecting desirable traits involves the combination of biology and technology. So that combination produces the term biotechnology. Not very surprised at that. But as it says in your notes, the first one is cloning. But really, any efforts to combine those two, we've been doing that for quite a long time in the agricultural industry. And you might be familiar with GMO, genetically modified organisms. Farmers have been, breeding different types of crops for years to get the biggest and the best and the sweetest and, the most plentiful. And for that, we are incredibly grateful. We should be, because we can just go to the grocery store and we just buy food, but we often have no concept of how much work and how many generations of plants have needed to been tested to produce what we're buying. So, but using genetics, we can alter organisms in quite dramatic ways by changing their DNA. Okay, and by breeding, and sometimes just by selectively breeding, but we can alter their DNA. This is a really bizarre species of chicken that is bred to not have feathers, which I can't imagine. I've never seen one of these in my life. But obviously, from a farming perspective, if these chickens don't have feathers, then they're really easy to harvest. So this is probably an extreme example. I'm not aware of it happening on a large scale, but it has definitely been possible. Another very common one is to take an or like a plant and make it seedless. So watermelons and other melons are a classic example of this. This, of course, is just a typical seeded watermelon. But if you do some cross breeding with other plants, or if there's ways that you can change the DNA, you could get or a plant, in this case, a watermelon that is seedless. And I've definitely tasted both, and sometimes I find that the normal seeded watermelons are just a bit sweeter, but it depends on where we get them from. But that's one example of biotechnology. I should come back to cloning, though, just briefly, because cloning made the news back in the 90s. Sorry, we come back to this. This is Dolly the sheep. A number of scientists and farmers were experimenting with the idea of cloning, and they actually successfully cloned a lamb, and then they named her Dolly. So if you can see in this picture, they took this adult Finn Dorset ewe that's white, and they got body cells. Okay, so these aren't sex cells. They took some body cells from her udder, and matured those in a process, and then combined that with an egg cell from this Scottish blackface ewe. Okay, so if you can see in the top right-hand corner, the egg was removed, but then they actually removed the nucleus. So all the DNA from the Scottish blackface ewe was removed, and then you have this what's called an enucleated egg cell. So that enucleated egg cell has no nucleus, but when the donor cell from the white ewe was brought near that cell, they used electricity. You can see there's electric pulses there on the bottom. They used electricity to kind of shock these two cells to get them to fuse, and then with further stimulation electrically, that those body cells from the white ewe actually triggered a new organism. And so that little cell division happened there, and there's an embryo that was formed, and then you implant that embryo into a healthy mother, into her uterus, and they were actually able to clone a lamb or a sheep. And so Dolly was she had exactly the same DNA as the adult Finn Dorset ewe, the white ewe on the right. She was definitely not a blackface ewe at all, okay? Because genetically she was a clone. Now, a lot of issues have arisen with clones. You'd think that we could do this more. This might be a more common practice, but it's actually extremely difficult to do, and at large scale, it has never been successful. It definitely made the news, though, and if you study genetics, you'll definitely learn the story of Dolly. And often cases, though, I'm not sure if Dolly was able to reproduce. I don't think she was. Typically, they find that if you try to clone an organism, it's potentially sterile. That could be a problem. Or also, there's lots of other health problems that resulted with other lambs that they tried this with. And so it's definitely has not proven to be a viable way for reproduction. There's a lot better ways or more efficient ways to encourage healthy reproduction of organisms. Now, with plants have naturally, some plants actually clone themselves quite easily. You can see in the top left-hand corner, a plant will grow what's called a runner. And it's like a horizontal root that kind of grows sideways, and then it burrows down into the ground and produces a new plant. Strawberries, a lot of strawberries do this. If you have strawberries in your garden, they have little runners that go out horizontally and then start a new plant. But those new plants are genetically identical to the first one. And not all plants, but a lot of plants, you can clone them by you cut part of the plant, and then using specific hormones in the right soil, you can actually turn those cuttings into whole and complete plants that are exactly identical to the first plant. And this process, of course, is not using the sexual reproduction that normally happens with plants, okay, where they normally either produce pollen or they have means of reproducing themselves sexually. Cloning is definitely bypassing that, and we're doing it asexually, or we're doing it through these means. So it is a possibility, and we have had some success with it, definitely more so with plants, but it's definitely because of human interaction. So there's some other types of artificial reproduction that you should know in general. The first one is artificial insemination. Any of you that work on ranches will be very familiar with this. All it requires is extracting sperm from a male, and then you artificially insert that into the female's, into her uterus, and make it possible for it to connect with her sex cells, with the egg cells in the female cow. Okay, so you can see all these processes, extracting the sperm first, and then artificially inseminating. That means to artificially insert the semen and the sperm of the male into the female. And ranchers do this all the time because they can ensure that all of their females get pregnant at the same time, basically, so that all of their calves are born around the same time. And it's a very good way to ensure that there's a lot of variability in the offspring of, say, a herd of cows. And that means that there's lots of variety, there's lots of reproduction. And so you can get a variety of different traits in different organisms, in different cattle, I should say, in different calves. And that ensures the health of the herd. But it also makes it a lot easier to manage, so that your calves aren't being born randomly over a period of 6 to 8 months. They're all being born in about a couple of weeks, hopefully, or within a month of time. All the female cows give birth. The other one is in vitro fertilization. That's the next one. This is where you actually remove the sperm and the egg from the male and female, and you combine them either in a petri dish or in a test tube. Sometimes you may have heard the term test tube babies. Okay. With humans, this is done often with a husband and a wife that aren't able to have kids. Okay, there's a lot of complications that can arise either with the mother or the father, so that they are not able to reproduce naturally. And because they want to have children, they opt for this method. And it's actually proven to be quite successful. Often in the process, you can fertilize multiple eggs at the same time, which leads to multiple babies at the same time. So sometimes, you can get 4 at a time, 5 at a time, 6. Sometimes these numbers are really quite impressive, but definitely, it's definitely been a phenomenon involved with in vitro fertilization. Okay, so again, if you caught that, you remove the egg and sperm. You can see in these steps, and they fertilize in step 4, not in the male or the female. They fertilize in a test tube or in a petri dish. And once that embryo is developed, then it is inserted using a cannula in that last step, in step 6. It's actually the embryo that's already starting to develop is inserted into the uterus of a healthy female, and then that offspring will continue to develop into a healthy human. Okay, and it is done with other organisms, but definitely we're more familiar with it with humans. So the last one is genetic engineering, and generally this is defined as it says any technology that alters the DNA of an organism. So we do this, actually the 2 examples on the left are kind of some testing ones. One, there's been some effort done, as I've been aware of, that we've tried to develop pigs that can grow organs that will not be rejected by humans. So pigs have an enzyme. It's basically a molecule that humans will, if it's exposed to human blood or to human tissues, it's rejected. So it's attacked by the human immune system, and it's destroyed. But if you can get around that, pig organs are quite similar to human organs, and if we can get around that, then we can use like heart valves, we can use liver and lungs, we can use all kinds of organs developed in pigs that could then be transplanted into a human that has a diseased organ that needs to be replaced, or that has a damaged heart valve, for example, that needs to be replaced. Natural tissues tend to outlast man-made tissues or synthetic replacements. And pig valves are actually used regularly already for some forms of heart repair. But it does involve, or it can involve, the use of genetic engineering. So altering the genes in certain pigs can enable their organs to not be rejected by humans. So that's kind of an interesting development. The one on the bottom left is quite a fascinating one. Humans have always been fascinated with spider web thread, or just the thread that spiders make, because it's insanely strong, stronger than steel, but it's incredibly light. And so some efforts have been made to try to genetically engineer that thread and make it, to mass produce it somehow. And one way that was tried was to get DNA to make spider thread in goat's milk, which is absolutely bizarre. But it's like taking the DNA that codes for spider web thread and insert that into the DNA of a goat. And so when the goat produces milk, that milk will also have spider web in it. And so that can be extracted. Anyway, it hasn't been super successful, but it's been an attempt to try and genetically engineer something. But probably the most successful one is using bacteria to generate a hormone called insulin. If you know anyone that has diabetes is a disease where your body can't make insulin. Your pancreas starts to fail and it doesn't produce the insulin that you need. Insulin is needed to uptake sugar into cells, so they can get the nourishment that they need. But if your body can't make it, we can kind of trick bacteria DNA to do that for us. And so you can see the steps here. Step 1, we remove what's called a plasmid. It's just a circular ring of DNA. And we can insert the insulin gene for human insulin into that plasmid in step 2 and 3. Then you get that back and you put that back into the bacteria, and then the bacteria will just reproduce, and their DNA will just make insulin, because that's what it codes for. And so on the bottom, step 7 there, you basically can concentrate that insulin, and then you make it available to diabetes patients. And it just it makes it so their lives can be essentially normal as possible, because they're able to take insulin or inject it into their bloodstream periodically. So the last part is maybe a little more hopeful too. What are ways that we can reduce our impact on biodiversity? The 4 strategies that are listed there. One, of course, as humans, we can create protected areas. We have lots of national parks in Alberta and definitely across Canada. And all across the United States, there's national parks. And by preserving certain areas, this is a picture of Moraine Lake in Banff, by the way, absolutely beautiful lake. I've only been there once, but it was just amazing. But thankfully, areas are being preserved that allow wildlife to exist as normal. and so that we can enjoy them and appreciate them, but it does bring stability to the natural ecosystems around us. The others, of course, as you can see, we can restore ecosystems and species, like returning wolves to Yellowstone. That's a really cool story. Resource use policies. Those are policies like no hunting at certain times of the year. If you want to go fishing, you buy a license so that you're declaring that you're willing to follow the fishing regulations. All of those types of things help to preserve species and to keep balance in the natural ecosystems. Then the last one is definitely controlling exotic species. We saw that in the video. Our government, as do all essentially in North America, we've gotten better at trying to regulate the import of foreign animals and to restrict how they enter the country so that we don't have the problems discussed in that video. Whoops, I forgot to type out that first one here. This really shows, reminds us of the first type of conservation, which is in situ conservation. In meaning within, situ, that's a kind of abbreviation for the root word situational or situation. So in situ conservation means efforts to maintain wild populations within their systems, their functioning ecosystems. So by establishing these protected areas, we are allowing and encouraging wildlife to thrive in their natural environment. So the opposite of that, though, is ex situ conservation. So these are efforts where we pull organisms out of their natural environment and we place them in a controlled environment where we encourage them to reproduce, such as in captive breeding, which happens in zoos, or where we maintain populations of plants, in numerous gardens, that are monitored and watered and kept care of by humans. Doing that enables us to, study plants and or these plants, I should say, in kind of the center here, but also to ensure that their populations are healthy. And then the really cool example is that seed bank in Norway. All across the world, countries have shipped like thousands and thousands of samples of really crucial seeds for the numerous crops that are grown all throughout the world. And they are shipped to this seed bank in Norway, where they are preserved in it's basically under the permafrost. So it's a very cold temperature, and they're kept and preserved there in the event that a country has need of kind of a seed bank. And so that's an example of ex situ. So we're pulling organisms out of their natural environment, and we are studying them and we're conserving them in that way. So that concludes that video, and I will let you work on those review questions that remind you or help you understand all of that vocabulary. So anyway, keep up the good work, you guys.